1964, Elmer Fleming, a man who had already stared death in the face during the Bradley disaster, stepped onto the SS Cedarville to take command. Moments later, he walked off, resigning forever. He didn't see a ghost. He saw a death trap. He saw a thinning hull, ignored safety warnings, and a corporate culture that prized tonnage over human life. Was Fleming a coward, or the only sane man on a doomed vessel? Tonight, we strip away the fog to expose a maritime slaughter masquerading as an accident. We'll dissect the captain's lethal refusal to abandon ship and a corporate culture that weaponized negligence for profit. Was this a tragedy of errors or a calculated sacrifice for profit? Join me as we peel back the layers of this forgotten tragedy, because only by looking into the deep can we understand why the Cedarville was lost long before the fog ever rolled in. You'll want to see how this puzzle finally comes together. My dear friends, to understand the ghost that haunts the Straits of Mackinac, we must first look at the bones of the machine. Long before it was a shipwreck, it was hull number 255. It was born in 1927 at the Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan, the very same cradle that would give life to the legendary Edmund Fitzgerald 30 years later. This was a vessel built for the industrial titan, the Pittsburgh Steamship Company, a subsidiary of the massive United States Steel Corporation. Initially christened the A.F. Harvey, she was a 600-foot titan of her time, 184 meters of riveted steel designed with one singular cold purpose: to feed the insatiable blast furnaces of the American steel belt with iron ore. She was a workhorse, powered by 3 coal-fired Scotch marine boilers and a triple expansion engine, churning out 2,200 horsepower. But even in her youth, the Harvey was no stranger to the violence of the lakes. Only a year into her career, in May 1928, she vanished into a heavy fog near Detroit, Michigan, and slammed into the whaleback steamer John Erickson. It was a chilling foreshadowing of the fog that would eventually claim her life decades later. By 1956, the ship had transitioned into the Bradley Transportation Fleet, part of the Michigan Limestone Division of U.S. Steel. She was re-registered to the port of Duluth, though she called Rogers City her home. During the winter layup of that year, at the Defoe Shipbuilding Company in Bay City, she underwent a radical transformation. They cut into her belly, installing hopper bottoms and a 250-foot self-unloading boom. She emerged from the yard painted in the signature Fleet Gray and rebranded with a new name, the SS Cedarville. But beneath that fresh coat of gray paint, a cancer was spreading. The transition from the Harvey to the Cedarville wasn't just a change of name. It was the beginning of a countdown. By the spring of 1961, the mask began to slip. A Coast Guard inspection revealed a terrifying truth. The ship's hull was rotting from the inside out. The 3/8-inch steel plating was thinned by decades of corrosion, pitted and weakened to the point of structural instability. The inspectors didn't just suggest a fix, they ordered it. They demanded the replacement of hull plating starting 80 feet aft of the bow on both sides. The cost of safety was calculated at $124,000. To a titan like U.S. Steel, this was a drop in the ocean. But to the managers of the Bradley fleet, it was an inconvenience. It was a disruption to a busy schedule. The company didn't see a weakened hull. They saw a loss in quarterly tonnage. The previous captain made a request that should have been unthinkable. He asked to delay the repairs until a more convenient time. The request was granted. Safety was traded for time. Even when the Lloyd's Register of Shipping and the ship's own insurance underwriters pounded on the door, demanding action, the repairs were pushed off indefinitely. Even after the Cedarville ran aground in the St. Mary's River in October 1964, requiring dry docking for emergency patches, the company refused to invest in replacing the aging steel. They replaced the boilers in 1961 to make her faster and more efficient, but they left the skin of the ship to rot. They improved the heart, but they ignored the ribs. This was the environment that Martin Jopish inherited. The promotion of Jopish to captain in March 1964 remains a shrouded mystery in the history of the Great Lakes. He was an experienced sailor with 18 years on the water, but his rise was the result of a sudden, unexplained vacuum. The previous master, Elmer Fleming, had stepped aboard the Cedarville that morning, looked at the ship, looked at the horizon, and simply left. He resigned on the spot. Fleming was a man who knew the weight of the water. He was a survivor of the SS Carl D. Bradley disaster years prior, a tragedy that had left him with what the crew called a nervous disposition. But perhaps it wasn't nerves. Perhaps it was a survivor's instinct. Fleming had seen a fleetmate break apart and vanish. He knew that the lakes do not offer second chances. Some say the foul weather that day triggered his trauma, but others believe he saw the Cedarville for what she was, a ticking time bomb. When Jopish took the helm, he wasn't just taking command of a ship, he was taking command of a culture of profit over life. The Bradley transportation fleet was the lifeblood of the U.S. Steel Empire. Limestone was the vital ingredient needed to scrub impurities from iron, and the pressure to deliver was relentless. Captains were handed optimistic schedules that ignored the reality of weather, ice, or the mechanical limits of a 40-year-old vessel. In this world, a captain's career wasn't measured by the safety of his crew, but by his ability to meet quotas. Missed deadlines and costly maintenance were career killers. This was the high-pressure tradition of the lakes, a prideful, dangerous culture where masters competed to see who could push their ships the hardest. It was a culture that had already claimed the Carl D. Bradley and the Daniel J. Morrell, yet it remained unchanged. As the 1965 season dawned, the quotas were higher than ever. Captain Jopish, still a relatively new master and eager to prove his worth to the company, accepted a hefty increase in tonnage requirements. He knew the hull was thinning. He knew the Coast Guard orders were still gathering dust in a filing cabinet, but he decided she was seaworthy. The lakes, however, had other plans. A brutal cold front swept through, and the recently cleared Straits of Mackinac froze over once more. The Cedarville found herself iced in, a prisoner of the Great Lakes winter. Every day spent stuck in the ice was a day of lost profit, a day that added more weight to the pressure mounting in Jopish's mind. By the time the ice finally broke in April 1965, the schedule was already in shambles. The need for speed became an obsession. Now, more than ever, the company propaganda stated, it is important to bring together quickly and efficiently the jobs to be done and the men who can do them. But efficiency in a fog is a death sentence, By the morning of May 7th, the Cedarville was loaded with 14,411 tons of open hearth limestone, bound for Gary, Indiana. The pressure to catch up on the season's quota was a ghost sitting on Jopish's shoulder. As he steered into the Straits of Mackinac, a super fog rolled in, a blinding white abyss that reduced the world to a few hundred feet. Standard seamanship demanded caution. The rules of the sea dictated a moderate speed. But Jopish, haunted by the company's tonnage requirements and his own desire to stay on schedule, made a choice that would seal the fate of 10 men. He kept the engines at full speed, 11.7 miles per hour, plowing into a blind horizon. As the SS Cedarville struggled against the stubborn ice of Lake Huron in the spring of 1965, an omen of her destruction was already moving across the Atlantic. Half a world away, a vessel of a different breed was beginning a voyage that would culminate in a lethal intersection. She was the MV Topdalsfjord, a Norwegian cargo ship just 6 years into her life. Built in the state-of-the-art shipyards of Gothenburg, Sweden, she represented the absolute pinnacle of modern maritime engineering. If the Cedarville was a relic of a bygone era, thinned by 40 years of corrosion and burdened by the weight of archaic industrial demands, the Topdalsfjord was her lethal antithesis. The Norwegian freighter was 6,000 tons of reinforced high-tensile steel, measuring 423 feet of Scandinavian precision. Unlike the coal-fed triple-expansion steam engines of the Cedarville, the Topdalsfjord was propelled by a massive 6,500 horsepower diesel engine. She wasn't merely a cargo ship, she was an icebreaker by design, built with a prow specifically reinforced to withstand the brutal churning of the North Sea and the relentless fury of the North Atlantic squalls. When she moved with the intent of an armored fist. By early May, the Topdalsfjord had navigated the St. Lawrence Seaway, a marvel of engineering that had opened only 6 years prior. This gateway allowed deep-draft ocean vessels to bypass the traditional barriers and sail directly into the industrial heart of the American continent. Laden with European-manufactured goods destined for Canada and the Midwest, she was a symbol of a new era of global trade. On the morning of May 7th, under the command of Captain Rasmus Hockland, she was cutting through Lake Michigan, bound for Port Arthur, Ontario. She was fast, she was strong, and she was on schedule. But as she approached the treacherous Straits of Mackinac, the world simply vanished. A super fog had descended, a blinding, suffocating white shroud so dense it felt like a physical entity. This wasn't a mist, it was an opaque abyss. From the bridge of the legendary 600-foot lake freighters, captains could no longer see the sterns of their own ships. Visibility was reduced to a few hundred feet, then a few dozen. In this white void, sight becomes a useless sense. Survival depends entirely on the rhythmic sweep of a radar screen and the lonely, primitive moan of the foghorn. Captain Hockland, a man of disciplined maritime tradition, was cautious. He stood on his bridge wing, the cold dampness clinging to his uniform, manually operating the ship's whistle. He sent 3 short, sharp blasts into the white nothingness at regular intervals, adhering strictly to the Great Lakes rules of the sea. Somewhere in that fog, the massive silhouette of the Mackinac Bridge loomed like a ghost, felt rather than seen. While the Norwegian ship moved with disciplined caution, the SS Cedarville was waking up to a day of routine labor. For the men of Rogers City, Michigan, these ships were more than just steel and steam. They were the local economy. Every spring, recruiters from the Bradley Transportation Company would walk the hallways of Rogers City High School. They weren't looking for scholars. They were looking for Lakers, young men who preferred the spray of the bow to the dust of a classroom. For boys who couldn't afford a college tuition or who simply felt the ancestral pull of the horizon, the Bradley fleet offered a steady paycheck, a warm bunk, and a brotherhood forged in iron. Dave Erickson was one of those boys. Since joining the company in 1959, he had paid his dues, rotating through the grueling heat of the engine room and the exposed labor of the deck crew. By 1965, he had become a porter, the domestic heartbeat of the ship. He was responsible for the captain's quarters, the officer's dining room, and the galley. On the morning of the May 7th, Dave reported for duty long before the sun struggled to pierce the fog. The Cedarville was heavy and sluggish, sitting dangerously low in the water with 14,411 tons of open hearth limestone destined for the steel mills of Gary, Indiana. The atmosphere on board was uncharacteristically light. The crew had just enjoyed an overnight stay in their home port, spending the evening with wives, children, and friends. As the ship pulled away from the dock at 5 a.m., Dave took advantage of the early hour to grab a quick nap in his bunk. When he finally rose at 7 a.m. to begin his shift in the captain's cabin, he realized the weather had turned treacherous. The temperature had plummeted to a bone-chilling 41 degrees. The fog was so thick it seemed to press against the hull like a wet blanket. Every few minutes, the Cedarville's foghorn would roar, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the very teeth in Dave's head and shook the floorboards of the galley. Around 9:50 a.m., Dave was in the galley helping prepare the midday meal. He stepped out to the port-side vegetable bin, a small exterior locker, to grab some potatoes. It was a mundane, domestic chore. But in an instant, the mundane became the horrific. A fellow porter, Jerome Kick, suddenly gripped Dave's shoulder, his knuckles white. "Hey Dave, look at this." Dave leaned over the railing, squinting into the white wall of the abyss. And then he saw it. A dark, jagged mass materializing out of the mist with the speed of a freight train. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. It was the bow of the Toppdalsfjord, rising like a guillotine. The Cedarville let out one final, desperate, agonizing blast of her whistle. But physics was no longer on their side. There was no thunderous explosion, no cinematic fireball. Instead, there was a sickening, metallic shudder. Dave felt the ship lurch as if it had been struck by a rogue wave from the deep. The reinforced, ice-breaking bow of the Norwegian vessel sliced into the Cedarville's portside at an almost perfect 90-degree angle. The modern Norwegian steel tore through the thinned, 40-year-old plating of the Cedarville at hatch number 7 like a knife through wet cardboard. For a few heart-stopping seconds, the two ships remained locked in a deadly embrace, the Toppdalsfjord's bow buried deep in the Cedarville's flank. Then, the Cedarville's massive forward momentum, 14,000 tons of stone moving at 11 miles per hour, pulled the ships apart. With a screech of tearing iron, the Norwegian ship slipped away, vanishing back into the white void as quickly as she had appeared, leaving behind a mortal wound. Dave and Jerome didn't wait for the alarm. They sprinted for their cabin to grab their life jackets. As the general alarm began to shriek its rhythmic warning, Dave raced through the narrow corridors, pounding on cabin doors, screaming for his crewmates to wake up. He knew the ship was dying. When he reached the deck again, he heard a sound that would haunt his dreams: the roar of Lake Huron rushing into the ship's belly. It sounded like a subterranean waterfall, a violent, unstoppable torrent. The deck crew scrambled in a frenzy of doomed heroism. They attempted to lower an emergency collision tarp, a heavy canvas meant to plug a hole, but the gash was a cavern. The suction was so immense that the massive tarp was sucked into the hull like a piece of tissue paper. The Cedarville began a heavy, sickening list to port. In a desperate, last-ditch effort to keep the ship level, the crew began pumping water into the starboard ballast tanks. Dave reported to his assigned station at lifeboat number 1 on the starboard side. He helped strip the canvas cover and lower the boat to the main deck, but the situation was collapsing. Looking toward the bow, he saw that the forward decks were already awash. The ship was no longer sailing. It was plunging. The weight of the limestone was a gravitational force that no pump could ever hope to fight. Suddenly, the list shifted. The Cedarville groaned and rolled violently to starboard. The crew remained eerily calm, moving with the urgent, quiet precision of men who knew their time was now measured in seconds. Dave jumped into the lifeboat, joining several of his brothers. But as the ship reached the point of no return, a frantic shout went up. "It won't release!" The falls, the mechanical pulleys that lower the boat, had jammed due to the extreme angle of the capsizing hull. In a split-second primal instinct for survival, Dave Erickson leaped out of the lifeboat and into the freezing 40-degree water. Seconds later, the SS Cedarville gave up the ghost. She abruptly capsized, rolling over like a dying whale and crushing the very lifeboat Dave had just escaped, trapping the men inside. Dave felt the massive underwater shudder as the bow struck the lake bed 200 feet below. He heard the muffled, terrifying roar of 14,000 tons of stone spilling out of the holds in an underwater landslide. Dave was dragged down by the massive suction, tumbling in the dark, icy pressure. After what felt like an eternity, he fought his way back to the surface, gasping for air that felt like fire in his lungs. When he wiped the water from his eyes, the 600-foot ship was gone. All that remained was 150 feet of the bottom of her hull, bobbing momentarily before it, too, slipped into the depths. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the crash. Dave was alone in the super fog, held up only by a cork life jacket, his limbs turning into lead from the cold. From the white abyss, he could hear the haunting, distant moans of other foghorns, and closer, the heart-wrenching screams of his brothers calling out in the dark. Finally, a life raft drifted through the mist. Strong hands reached out, pulling Dave Erickson from the freezing grip of Lake Huron. He was too weak to stand, his body racked by tremors. As he lay on that raft, surrounded by the few who had made it, the crushing reality set in. The ship was gone. The mission was over. In the white silence of the Mackinac Straits, the Great Lakes had once again claimed their toll in blood, iron, and stone. On the morning of May 7th, 1965, the bridge of the SS Cedarville was a high-tech fortress of false security. As the 602-foot limestone carrier moved toward the Straits of Mackinac, the atmosphere inside the wheelhouse was one of concentrated, tense professionalism. Under the command of Captain Martin Yopich, the ship was steering directly into a super fog, a white, opaque abyss that had swallowed the Great Lakes whole. Despite the blinding conditions outside the windows, Yopich placed his absolute faith in his instrumentation. The RCA radar hummed with a rhythmic pulse. The radio direction finder searched for invisible beacons, and the gyro compass held their heading with mechanical precision. Every piece of navigation and communication equipment was fully operational, and yet the dread was palpable. Visibility had been deteriorating steadily since they left the port of Calcite, but Yopich refused to yield to the weather. The Cedarville continued to plow through the churning waters of Lake Huron, at her maximum speed of 11.7 miles per hour, a lethal velocity in a world where the horizon had ceased to exist. As they neared the massive, invisible silhouette of the Mackinac Bridge, the radio crackled to life. Yopik established contact with a downbound vessel, the Benson Ford. Over the radio telephone, a passing arrangement was verbally agreed upon. Minutes later, the two steel giants slipped past each other with about half a mile of clearance. It was a phantom encounter. The fog was so dense that not a single lookout on the Cedarville ever caught a glimpse of the other ship. Shortly after this near miss, Yopik contacted a German freighter in the vicinity, the Weissenberg, commanded by Captain Werner May. As the Weissenberg passed under the bridge, Captain May sent a chilling, urgent warning over the airwaves. There was another vessel, a Norwegian ship, not far ahead and heading directly into the Cedarville's path. Yopik immediately attempted to hail this unknown vessel, but his radio calls were met with a haunting, static silence. Beside him, third mate Charles Cook stood frozen at the radar screen. His voice began to rise in pitch as he watched a blip on the green display, a blip that represented thousands of tons of moving steel, closing the distance with alarming speed. The accounts of what transpired on that bridge in the final minutes would later become the center of a fierce legal firestorm. Yopik would eventually swear under oath that he reduced his speed to slow ahead, but the ship's internal logs and the harrowing testimony of those in the wheelhouse painted a much darker picture. Wheelsman Leonard Gabris maintained that the Cedarville only slowed to half speed after the failed radio contact. The tension reached a breaking point as the rhythmic, haunting moan of the Norwegian vessel's fog whistle grew louder, vibrating through the very hull plates of the Cedarville. In a desperate bid to create space, Yopik ordered a course change, swinging the freighter hard to the right. But the shadow on the radar remained relentless. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. A lookout stationed on the bridge wing screamed, "There she is!" At that exact moment, the watchman on the bow caught sight of a massive, jagged shape emerging from the white wall like a predator. He shouted a frantic warning into the wind. The other ship was only half a block away. Leonard Gabrick saw her too, a wall of Scandinavian steel just 100 feet ahead and closing fast. Yopik roared an order for slow ahead, but Charles Cook's voice cut through the panic. "Captain, we're going to hit." In a final, futile attempt to dodge the inevitable, Yopik commanded full ahead and hard right. But physics had already signed their death warrant. On the other side of the white curtain, Captain Rasmus Hauckland of the M5 Topdalsfjord had been navigating with extreme Norwegian discipline. His engines were at dead slow, crawling at a mere 3 or 4 knots. He had heard the Cedarville's signals and was expecting a safe passing on his starboard side. Hauckland was standing outside on his starboard bridge wing when he heard a long, deafening blast of a whistle. Without warning, the Cedarville materialized out of the fog, crossing directly in front of his bow at a distance of only 250 feet. Hauckland threw his engines into reverse, but his 6,000-ton ship was already committed to its path. At 9:55 a.m. on May 7th, 1965, the reinforced, ace-breaking bow of the Topdalsfjord slammed into the port side of the Cedarville at an almost perfect right angle. The impact occurred at Hatch Nea Bay, tearing through the thinned steel like parchment. The two ships remained locked together for a few agonizing moments, a deadly embrace of iron, before the Cedarville's massive forward momentum tore them apart. The Cedarville vanished back into the fog, her side ripped open to the icy heart of the lake. While the Norwegian crew was unharmed and their ship was not in danger of sinking, a nightmare was unfolding for the men of the Bradley fleet. Captain Yopik, reeling from the impact, initially believed he could still wrestle the ship to safety. He ordered the engines stopped, sounded the general alarm, and dropped the port anchor to stabilize the vessel. He reported the disaster to the Mackinac Island Coast Guard Station and the nearby Weissenberg. However, the reports coming from the cargo holds were catastrophic. The ship was taking on a massive volume of water, and the emergency collision tarp, a desperate measure to plug the leak, had failed completely, sucked into the hull by the sheer force of the incoming lake. It was in this moment that Yoppish made the decision that would define the tragedy. He decided to run. He ordered the anchor raised and commanded full ahead, pumping water into the starboard ballast tanks in a frantic attempt to counteract a worsening list to port. But instead of aiming for the nearest shallow water, Graham Shoal, which was only 1 mile away, he set his sights on Mackinac City, over 2 miles away across deep, unforgiving water. Third mate Charles Cook plotted a course that would prove to be a fatal delusion. The forward motion did not save the ship. It only forced the lake deeper and faster into her broken ribs. Within minutes, the Cedarville was doomed. The list became so extreme that her decks began to disappear. Yet, through the chaos, no order to abandon ship was ever issued. As the bow finally plunged under and the ship began a violent roll to starboard, Leonard Gabrick, the only man on the bridge who had managed to don a life jacket, prepared to jump for his life. As he escaped the flooding bridge, he saw Charles Cook struggling desperately to get his life jacket on, his hands fumbling with the straps as the world turned upside down. Gabrick lost sight of the mate as the ship capsized. Charles Cook's body would never be recovered from the depths. The Weissenberg, having watched the Cedarville vanish from their radar screen, did not wait for a distress call. Captain May launched his lifeboats into the super fog immediately, his men rowing toward the sounds of disaster. Dave Erickson, floating on a small life raft with several of his brothers, watched as the German sailors emerged like ghosts from the white void. The crew of the Weissenberg acted with heroic, professional speed, pulling the frozen, traumatized men from the 41-degree water. Once safely on board the German ship, the survivors were met with a scene of grim mercy. They were wrapped in blankets and given hot tea and coffee to combat the onset of hypothermia. Dave watched in a daze as the German sailors performed frantic, rhythmic CPR on his unconscious crewmates right on the deck. But for 2 of them, the shock of the cold was too much. They died there, under the gray skies of the Straits. The final toll was a devastating blow to the tight-knit community of Rogers City. Out of 35 crew members, 10 lost their lives. Nearly the entire engine crew, those men who had stayed at their posts, waiting for a command to leave that never came, went down with their ship. The survivors were eventually transferred to the Coast Guard cutter Mackinac and rushed to local hospitals. Dave Erickson was eventually reunited with his wife and 2 children, but the man who returned was not the same man who had left. He and every other survivor would spend the rest of their lives haunted by the oppressive silence of the bridge and the echoing screams of their brothers in the fog. In the immediate wake of the sinking, as the cold waters of Lake Huron settled over the broken ribs of the Cedarville, a different kind of storm began to brew on land. United States Steel went into an immediate defensive overdrive. The memory of the Carl D. Bradley disaster was still a bleeding wound in the public consciousness, and the company knew that another catastrophe, especially one born of poor maintenance and a neglected hull, could be financially ruinous. To protect the empire, they needed a scapegoat. Initially, they pointed their fingers at the Norwegian crew of the Topdalsfjord, But the United States Coast Guard investigation quickly stripped away that illusion. U.S. Steel's legal team attempted to invoke the Fifth Amendment on behalf of Captain Martin Jopik, seeking the right to remain silent. But a federal judge delivered a crushing blow to their strategy, ruling that maritime law demanded accountability over silence. Jopik was forced to testify. Under the harsh lights of the inquiry, his story began to unravel. His testimony was a labyrinth of contradictions. It clashed with the accounts of his own surviving crew, the ship's logs, and the cold data of the radar. The Board of Inquiry ultimately labeled his words as self-serving and largely false. The final verdict was a devastating indictment. While Captain Hockland and the Topdalsfjord were cleared of wrongdoing, having operated with reasonable caution, the weight of the tragedy fell squarely on Jopik. It was determined that he had plowed through the super fog at maximum speed, ignoring established track lines and multiple warnings. Most damning of all, the investigation highlighted the 20 wasted minutes after the collision. Instead of saving his men, Jopik had squandered the only time they had. Because he failed to issue the order to abandon ship, nearly the entire engine crew remained at their stations until the lake claimed them. Though he avoided criminal prison, Jopik suffered the ultimate professional death. His master's license was stripped away. He would never again command a vessel or feel the roll of the Great Lakes beneath his feet. Yet, beneath the verdict, a larger ghost remained: the culture of U.S. Steel. The inquiry exposed an environment where profit was weaponized against safety, where captains were pressured to prioritize tonnage over human lives. The families of the 10 who perished maintained that Jopik was merely a product of an unsafe system. A man, never truly fit for command, placed in a ship that was a steel coffin long before it sank. Today, the SS Cedarville lies upside down on the bed of Lake Huron. She has become a popular, albeit treacherous, diving site, a ghostly cathedral of rusted iron and spilled limestone. She sits in the dark as a silent, haunting reminder of the risks sailors take every day and the heavy price paid when greed is allowed to steer the ship. The fog may have cleared in 1965, but the echoes of those 20 minutes still ripple across the water, warning us that the true cost of progress is often measured in the souls we leave behind. Finally, before wrapping up today's message, thank you for standing with me in the fog of 1965. If you have a personal connection to this tragedy or a maritime mystery that haunts you, please share your story in the comments. Your voice keeps their memory alive. If this journey moved you, support our mission with a like and share. Subscribe to join our crew for future voyages into the deep. Until next time, stay safe on the water.